Good afternoon or good evening to my AP Human Geography class. Today we're going to be looking at the agricultural revolutions, and there's three of them that we need to know. So let's get into it. So the first one is the first agricultural revolution, and this was an environmental transformation that occurred about 10,000 years ago. And what that means is essentially that's when the humans started impacting their environment through farming. And as we kind of talked about a little bit before, the first agricultural revolution, or the Neolithic agricultural revolution, was when humans went from hunter-gatherer societies to actual farming societies. And farming societies was basically settlements in the development of civilization. People actually started living in cities in development of civilization occurred. And we talked extensively about, some of the positives and negatives with the Jared Diamond article. So if you want to take a look at that, look at previous work that was posted on Score. Some early agricultural hearths were in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, Western Africa, the Fertile Crescent, and China. We've already kind of taken a look at this, so kind of speeding along a little bit over the first agricultural hearth. If you have any questions, just email me or just look at previous material. Okay. The second agricultural revolution. This is kind of a little bit newer material. This was a precursor to the Industrial Revolution, which happened in the 18th century, so approximately like 1760s. And this began in the United Kingdom, Denmark, and other lower countries in Europe. And essentially, the Enclosure Act was one of the biggest reasons why this happened. And the Enclosure Act was basically farmers would enclose their land with fences. And back then, there was a lot of subsistence farming. And as we know, subsistence farming is typical of LDCs, which don't have that much money. And they barely just get by. So when they build these fences, they have to sell their land in order to even pay for it. And unfortunately, this caused a lot of farmers to actually end up selling all of their land to wealthy landowners. And this was a switch from open farms to private farms. And private farms is basically commercial agriculture to some extent. So that's when agriculture was becoming increasingly industrialized, and there was a primary as well as secondary aspect, economic activity aspect of this second agricultural revolution. And as we talked about in class, these are some vocab terms that you should know. If you have any questions, once again, email me. But this is all in your textbook. There's just some examples of how agriculture was specialized. And it allowed a shift in the workforce beyond subsistence farming. And as I was saying, it allowed people to start working in factories and started becoming more secondary economic activity levels. People started manufacturing goods more, and agriculture became more industrialized and more modernized. And that allowed for more production. And as I was saying, one of the best ways to look at the second agricultural revolution is to look at it in terms of it includes the primary activity, economic activity, as well as the secondary economic activity. Primary is extraction of raw goods, whereas secondary is manufacturing. And basically more complicated processes, and the more complicated processes, is, especially in agriculture, the more production that's made. And the third agricultural revolution. This blends primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of economic activity. So not only are people extracting the materials, manufacturing the materials, but there's also selling of the materials on a global scale. And this intensifies the use of farming, mechanized farming, and the development of biotechnology. And it's a rapid diffusion of agriculture techniques, and it helped the global south countries increase crop yields. And one of the big reasons that this happened is because there was a necessity for it. People in LDCs, they had a huge population growth after World War II, and there was a lot of people who actually said that we wouldn't be able to keep up. Like, we wouldn't be able to keep up with the growing population. Hopefully you guys remember in your textbooks about Africa. Africa, for example, has increased their agriculture production, I think about 4 times during the 20th, like later 20th century, or 20th century. So basically like 1940s to 1970s. But their population has grown exponentially as well, and we just haven't produced enough. So even though production's going up, we need more production to keep up with the rapid population growth. And here's an example of a modernized factory. Here are silos. As you can see, there's a lot of technology involved here. You can see the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels within this picture. You see the fields, it's primary. Secondary, you can see like trucks, manufacturing, as well as these. And trucks can also be argued that it's tertiary because you're selling the materials as well through the trucks. And as I said before, these are silos and they contain grains. So this is kind of just an example of the increasing industrialization of agriculture. Here's a video that you guys can watch. Here's a link, and it's kind of an introduction to Norman Borlaug, and he's the father of the Green Revolution. So take a look at that when you're viewing this PowerPoint at this point. You can pause it or whatever. And he's the father of the Green Revolution. This man is very important. As we saw in Harvest of Fear, he actually had like a center made because of him. He's a very important person. And just to kind of frame this for you, in the 1960s, there was a famous book called The Population Bomb. And he predicted in the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. The person who wrote this specifically was talking about India. And there was a lot of starvation in India. However, Norman Borlaug comes in around like the 1960s. He was doing research, and he developed cereals that were insensitive to the number of hours of light in a day, and they could therefore be grown in many climates. He also developed high-yield, disease-resistant dwarf wheats, and essentially this doubled wheat production between 1965 and 1970 in India. Another outcome of this was in the 1960s for Mexico, harvest was 6 times larger than in 1944. By 1974, India was self-sufficient. So he basically saved a ton of lives of people who were starving. And he, developed dwarf wheat, high yield disease resistance, and this averted famine in Mexico, India, and China. And the Green Revolution was also, it used lots of chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, plant breeding, which is basically just intermingling plants, kind of like, if you think about it, an example is like dog breeding. You're trying to get the right combination for the right traits. So in farming, you want, crops that are disease resistant and they produce a lot of yields. And GR is the term now used as a descriptor for any country's use of high yield technology. And some people have become worried about this. As agriculture has become more technology driven, there's some things that are just a little bit odd. This is obviously just a cartoon, but it's kind of capturing that fear that people have that we are modifying our food so much that something bad might happen because of this. And this is really characteristic of the bio-revolution. They talked a lot about this in Harvest of Fear, so hopefully this is a good refresher. It's currently under the third revolution as well, so this is not a different revolution. It's just another aspect of the third revolution. And this incorporates genetic engineering. And as we saw in the Harvest of Fear, it uses transgenics of agricultural products. And transgenics is basically when you're putting in genes from other animals, organisms that aren't able to be normally produced. So like I think an example of the Harvest of Fear, you can mix like a donkey and a horse, and you can classically breed that. But there's no way of getting, like, I think the strawberry example, if you guys remember, there's no way of getting a fish gene inside of a strawberry. That's just not possible. But under biorevolution and through the research of transgenics, this is possible. Here's a video that you guys can click on in the PowerPoint, hopefully. If you cannot, just email me and I'll do a YouTube link. But this is actually a video of cats that glow in the dark. So it's just an example of what GMOs can do. And so the widespread use of these GM foods result in an increased food supply, disease control, but it also gave rise to a new kind of organic farming. This is really talking about how there's a rise of people who want to go back to the old ways. They want to go back to how farming was done before all of these GMOs and these chemical herbicides and like pesticides. But as we kind of talked about in class, just because something is genetically modified does not mean it's organic. Organic farming is basically a more natural form of farming, and they kind of talked about it in the book, but there's different ideas of what organic farming is. But kind of think of it as a limited use of pesticides and herbicides, and they have to follow strict rules on how much they can use these herbicides, and there's also an emphasis on soil health as well as the treatment of animals. So when you guys look at the supermarket for organic foods, try reading their labels. Try like seeing what companies produce it and see what their definition of organic farming is. But generally, organic farming is a more natural way of farming with a reduced amount of pesticides and herbicides, and they typically want more sustainable agriculture. Whereas you don't really want the soil to be depleted of nutrients, and you don't want your animals to be mistreated. Okay, so that's revolutions everywhere. Hopefully that was a good wrap up of the revolutions. If there's any questions, any technical difficulties with this lecture, just email me. And I hope you guys have a great night. And I hope to see you guys tomorrow. Hopefully we don't get too much snow. Okay, guys.